Today we are doing our fourth part of our series on interviews. And so today we're going to talk about preparing for the in-person interview. I'm going to talk for a few minutes and then I'm going to send it over to Rob Gorbett, who is going to talk more about FIRST and experiences actually at a FIRST competition. Okay, so let's go to my first slide. So here's our overview. We're going to talk about our previous workshops, do a quick summary. Today, we're also going to talk about communication and how you communicate with people, the different types of relationships, because that's really important to understand the differences between the two. We're going to talk about tips and tricks on how to basically just talk to people. Think about when you meet somebody new. So what you want to think about. We'll talk a little bit about body language, although we covered that in the last presentation as well. And then Rob is going to take us through attending FIRST competitions. So our four-part series, first we talked about writing our content for our resumes, applications, and cover letters. Then we talked about what to bring to our interview when we actually get our interview. We talked about virtual interviews, and today, like I said, in person. So really quickly, what we talked about in our last one, which was last week, is we talked about the STAR method. And if you're curious about what that is, you can always check out one of our previous YouTube videos. We talked about the differences between virtual and traditional interviews. Oops, sorry. Then we talked about similarities between them because there are definitely a lot of similarities between the virtual and the in-person interview. We talked about how to set up, so how you set up your space. We talked about how you look at the camera when you're having an interview, a virtual interview. We did some do's and don'ts about the interviews. We talked a little bit about the phone interview and we discussed the impossible question. So communication. So just like any skill, communication building, it often comes naturally to some people, but it sometimes is less natural to other people. And we just need to practice. I did have a really fun little video talking about practice makes perfect, but we did watch that the last time. So we'll just move on here. So I'm going to go to my next slide because we all know that practicing is always your best. Is always.
Anything is possible through.
Okay, so let's get down to it. There are two different relationships, pretty obvious. There's our friendships and our professional relationships. And you can think about kind of, in a mentor-student relationship, you know that it's a professional relationship, talking to your friends, talking to your classmates, that's a friendship. To teacher-student, same thing. It's a professional relationship. So just as long as you kind of understand the differences and kind of how you are going to interact, because they have a very different interaction style. So we want to talk about confidence. So when you meet somebody for the first time, depending on if we're in a COVID situation, if we're in COVID, we're obviously not going to shake hands, but you're going to do something that lets them know that you're open and interested in conversing with them. So you're going to look them in the eye. You want to take interest in one of their interests. So you want to be curious. And today there was an awesome example of curiosity. When we hopped onto this call, we talked a little bit at the beginning about kind of what people are doing now. And one of the attendees asked a question, tell me a little bit more about this. And we had this amazing conversation that lasted a few minutes, kind of listening about, the interests of the people that were involved in this conversation. So how do we do that? We want to ask questions. We want to know what they do, where they do it, what they're curious about. And if you want to have a deeper conversation with somebody, you want to pick one piece of something they're talking about and ask a deeper question. This is also really important when you're at a competition, at a FIRST competition, or really any competition, you want to walk away with a reason to come back and talk to them again. So before you walk away and say goodbye, think about what you would say to that person next, because you want to continue that relationship. Same with it when you're in an interview, take interest in what that person is talking about, because if you take interest, then it's, then they're going to feel like they're listened to. So confidence is faked. Most people, not all people, are very insecure, and we all want the same thing. We want to be acknowledged, we want to be cared about, and we want to be successful in our own way. And so you've heard the term fake it till you make it. You just, feel good about who you are, but come across confident, but not overconfident. We talked about that in the last presentation. But you know, everybody wants to be cared for. Everybody wants to be heard. When you meet somebody for the first time, if you feel nervous, because often when you're meeting somebody, and especially like at a robotics competition and you're meeting with a judge, you're very nervous because you want to make a good impression. But you also want to remember, oftentimes that person may also be nervous talking to you because they've never met you before. They want to learn more about you. And so just remember that you may actually be on a similar footing with them than you think. So anyway, so again, we talked about body language. So you want to make eye contact. You want to look at the person in the eye who you're talking to. This goes without saying, you want to have good personal hygiene, so no gum chewing, and we all want to take showers before we go somewhere. We want to be respectful oh wait, hold on, I got to go to the next slide. Here we go. Remember that you have talking points. And just like we talked about in a previous presentation, if you've prepared for your interview, so if you've gone through and thought about the questions that people are going to answer you and you've written them down bullet form, think about what your talking points are. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Rob's going to talk a little bit about, how you want to, come across in, as you're doing that. And you also want to be respectful to all first judges and volunteers at all times, because people are always watching for your positive behavior and they will notice behavior that isn't as positive. So it doesn't go across with the gracious professionalism. A lot of this information was taken from the FRC 971 Spartan Robotics. And so I just wanted to draw attention to that. So I'm going to pass it over now to Rob. And Rob, do you want to introduce yourself? Because Rob is awesome, and Rob and I have been working for a number of years, but I'll let him talk about who he is and what he does.
Thanks, Michelle. I don't know if I'm awesome. I've been involved in FIRST for a long time, so I guess that makes me awesome by default. I've been working with FIRST in various capacities since 2002. So that's before many of you were born. I judged at the very first Canadian regional. That then became the Greater Toronto Regional, which then became the Toronto District Championship, the one that's held at the Hershey Center. I've been a judge advisor for over a decade. I've judged a championship. I started the Waterloo Regional and was the planning committee chairperson for that for a long time. And I sit on the board of directors of FIRST Robotics Canada. So I've been around a while. I will preface my remarks by saying I haven't actually been a pit judge in several years. And so some of the things I have to say I know will still hold true generally, but I'll try not to get into too many of the details because I'm not sure how much the details of the process have changed. I want to pick up, before I start on the first specific aspects of this, I want to pick up on a couple of things that Michelle said. She talked about being interested and asking questions and being confident. And I want to reassure you and reiterate that having questions is not a sign of weakness. Having questions is a sign of interest and a sign that you are open to growing. It doesn't mean that you don't know what you're doing, and it doesn't mean that you're somehow lacking. And so the best way that I've found to describe this is being both humble and curious, but also confident at the same time. And humility doesn't mean that you're somehow lesser. So I encourage you to think about those words: humble, curious, confident, because they can coexist all at the same time. And sometimes we get models that show us that they can't, that we shouldn't be, if we know what we're doing, we shouldn't have questions, or we shouldn't be humble. So next slide. Thanks, Michelle. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens before the event. So as a team, you should study the awards. The awards are all in the game manual, and there are judging criteria for each awards. They're sometimes called guidelines, and judges go back and forth about whether they're criteria and guidelines and the difference between those words. But know what each award is for, and know what the judges will be looking for, because they're working from the same document. And they'll be looking to try to, essentially tick boxes and write down stories that relate to the guidelines and the criteria for each of the awards. know which awards your team is a serious contender for. There are, over a dozen awards in FIRST, and no team is sort of equally eligible, strongest in the field for all of the awards. So if you know, for example, that your robot is really good this year, focus on a couple of machine awards. Pick the one for the control system or the one for creativity. Pick one or two that you think you're particularly strong contenders for. And then plan your story around that. So think about the interview ahead of time. Think about what you're going to say. You don't have a lot of time, especially we're talking about PIT interviews for now. I'll talk just briefly about chairmans after this, but PIT interviews, you've got very little time, and each of the judges that comes by your PIT during your interview is going to be interviewing probably 15 other teams, and they're doing it all in a very short amount of time. And they're trying to take notes, and they're trying to keep an eye on time, and they're trying to be courteous to you and keep eye contact. It's a difficult thing to do. So know what you're going to say and plan it out. In that regard, what Michelle was saying earlier about knowing your speaking points. So I kind of think of any presentation, whether that's an interview or a talk for a judge, or even when I'm lecturing at the University of Waterloo, when I get in front of the classroom, I usually start at a point where I don't really know what I want to say. And if I just did the lecture at that point or did the interview at that point, it would all come out mumbled. And it's better if I think about what I want to say and I practice. And particularly if it's a short interview or a short speech, I might get to the point where I learn the script by heart. The problem with that is that then it comes across scripted and memorized, and it doesn't come across as human. And so I often talk about getting beyond the point where you know the script by heart, where you know what you want to say about your robot, or you know what you want to say about your team by heart, and you distill that back down to some speaking points. And if you know those speaking points really well, and you've practiced the longer, more detailed talk, doesn't matter if you vary off script or go off script a little bit. If you know your speaking points, you'll find ways to bring those back in, and it'll feel much more natural, and you'll cover the things that you want to cover. So for both kinds of awards, PIT interviews and chairmans, just make sure you practice. Practice, practice, practice makes perfect. And I don't remember what my last bullet was because the slide just changed. Okay. So I wanted to talk a bit about supporting material. If you are going to give things to the judges, like a one-pager, picture of your robot, it's very helpful. But remember to keep it small. They are visiting a dozen or more, maybe 15, 20 teams, and they can't carry around all that stuff and sort of keep it organized. They also will not have time to read a lot of stuff when they go back to the judges' room. So don't be under the impression that if you give them a 10-page document, they're going to be able to later go over that, because they won't, with certain exceptions. So entrepreneurship award, the ones that require you to make written submissions, there's time built into the schedule for that. But for the most part, you need to convey what you need to convey. They need to take notes, and whatever you're giving them is a reminder, right? One way to do that is to have like a baseball card for your robot. So like a picture, some of the key facts, keep them quantitative. That way you don't have to talk about numbers so much in your interview, and you can keep that at a higher level. Talk about numbers if you want, there's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes people get flustered when they have to remember a bunch of numbers in an interview. So put the quantitative stuff on a small piece of paper that has a picture of your robot. That's how a lot of judges want to remember what they saw, and hand that to them. But prepare all of that ahead of time. Thanks, Michelle. So for PIT interviews, what happens before your judges get to the PIT? And so I'm gonna tell you this from the judge's perspective. The judges will all have gathered in the judging room, and they will have divided up the teams that they're going to go interview, because there isn't enough time for every judge to interview every team. So you have to think of cohorts of judges going out, and in each cohort interviews a subset of teams, sometimes for a subset of the awards. A pretty common structure is that pairs of judges will go out to interview a subset of teams for the machine-related awards, and another pair of judges will go out to interview the same subset of teams for what we call the Team Attribute Awards. Then different pairs are interviewing other subsets for both of those sets of awards, Team Attribute and Machine Awards. So when you see a group of judges approaching your pit, if it's 2 judges, chances are that it's the first day and this is the first round of interviews. If it's more than 2 judges, either that event is very rich in judges, or this is a second interview and they're coming back to get more information. If they're doing that, the chances are that you've been shortlisted for something. That isn't always the case, because there also are what are called ambassador interviews. But if you're getting judges coming back and they're asking questions again about the same award, you want to make sure to have your best spokespeople there. When they arrive at your pit, make sure you know who's going to talk. Have spokespeople that know how to speak to each of the types of awards. Often it's, you'll have one person who's really good at talking about machine awards, and you'll have a different person who's really good at talking about things like team spirit and sportsmanship, for example. Ask the judges how they'd like to run the interview. Ask them how much time you have, because that will vary from event to event. It could be anywhere as low as 7 or 8 minutes, and it might be up to 15 minutes. Ask if there are particular aspects of the team or the robot that they'd like to hear about, because time is precious. And if they can tell you, well, we're really here to talk about your robot, then you won't spend a lot of time talking about the team structure or your entrepreneurship application, for example. Okay, and ask them how they'd like to run the interview. Some judges want to start asking questions right away. Some judges would like you to give them a bit of a spiel and then leave time for questions. And some judges are just happy to listen to you talk and take notes. So ask them. Some of the constraints that judges are facing, and that therefore you're facing as well during this interview, are time, noise, people, and matches. Time is an obvious one. You have a very short amount of time in the interview. Noise is also obvious. The pits are very loud, and some of the judges, like myself, are older and we don't have as good hearing as we used to have. So if there's a way to pull the judge away into a quieter spot near the pit, or that, feel free to suggest that. Having too many people around can be very distracting. So my suggestion is have no more than about 4 people, maybe a mentor and 3 students, or mentor and 4 students, but limit the people who do the talking to 1 or 2. So that shows that the team is interested in how the interview is going, but it won't confuse the interviewer when you have a bunch of people all talking in different ways. And of course, the match schedule influences as well. So if judges come to you and are willing to talk to you when your robot is not there, the chances are that they're not interested in the robot awards. A robot machine judge will always wait until the robot's in the pit. Next slide. What are your goals? We've talked a lot about this stuff already, but basically tell your story. Manage the interview environment, the people around, the noise. Emphasize awards that you think you're competitive for. Don't feel bad about saying, this year we're not that strong on creativity, but we really feel like we've got a strong control system. That really helps to limit the scope of the interview and will save time. Make sure you're connecting back to the awards criteria and give them a way to remember and advocate for you. And the reason I say advocate is that at some point, because not every judge has seen every team, at some point in the judges' room, there will be a short list. And it will be up to the judges that interviewed the teams on the short list to basically argue the case for their team or present the case for their team. Sometimes it's obvious which team should rise to the top and get the award. Other times it's not, and a lot will depend on how much the judge can remember and advocate for you. Last slide. So that was for paid interviews. For Chairman's Award interviews, I think the most important thing is to understand the format. How many minutes do you have for a presentation? How many minutes for Q&A? What's the size of team that you can bring in? Understand your roles. If you're bringing 3 students in, make sure that all 3 students have a role. Both a formal role, maybe in the presentation, you've got a scripted thing where you're passing it back and forth, but also the informal roles, like who's going to keep an eye on the time, who's going to answer what types of questions, so that when they ask a question about the history of your team and the numbers of students that you've had on the team over various years, it's not like, who wants to take that question? Somebody is ready to take that question. Be believable. One of the big things that happens in Chairman's Awards is that students tend to say things that they have heard through the lore of their team. So through no fault of the student, they've been told, you know, our team helped start the Kansas Regional. And then it turns out that they played a very, very minimal role or not at all. So make sure that you know the facts and the history of your team so that you can come across as believable. And I think we're out of time, and that is my last slide. So I have a thank you. Are there any questions? But I don't think there's any opportunity for questions here. So I'll just let Michelle take it back and let me know what's up.
Awesome. Oh, Rob, that was fabulous. So I just want to thank everybody for attending today. That is actually, we are done with our time. So I'm just going to post a really quick poll here. If you wouldn't mind answering the question, that would be fabulous. I'm going to also post a link if you wouldn't mind giving us some feedback on how this went. So this concludes our presentation on interviews, and you can always watch previous parts. We have part 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can check them out on our YouTube channel. But I just want to thank Rob today for coming in. I learned like a lot today, and I've been attending competitions for a long time. So anyway, thank you so much, everybody. And I will